Hi, welcome to another Typology interview. We have Joel Witt and Antonia Dodge. How's it going, guys?
Good. How are you?
Hi,
Good.
Benjamin.
So you guys have a company called Personality Hacker.
We do.
You've been in the business for a long time. How many years now?
No, it's
Sensory
okay.
question.
In
No,
the
no.
business, but it's like that's just a good. Well, we've been actually practically doing this since about 2014, like in a concerted business
Right.
building kind of way, like actually trying to make an entity out of what we do.
Right.
But the Personality Hacker LLC handle has been official since 2012.
Right.
And I first started getting into this at around 2010. So it was just, it was a
like
lot
anything,
of,
there's like a lot of evolution.
yeah, there's like evolutions to it.
Right.
So doing it full time since 2010, but I would say that its current incarnation is since January of 2014.
Let me be more clear. Here's how it starts. You start coaching, you start talking about these things, you start writing and blogging about stuff. And then you're like, hey, people like this. This is interesting. People are taking to it. And you start to connect with other smart people. And then you come to a point, after many years of this, a lot of coaching and calibration stuff, you go, this could be a livelihood. This could be something that we support ourselves with and give back and contribute. And that moment happened around 2014 is when we started to take all the things we've been doing loosely all over the place, unorganized, and we organized it. That's when we started our podcast. That's when we really started taking our business side serious. We started to make it into something that we wanted to make our livelihood and the thing we did with our lives.
Right.
So that's like the best way to probably see, because there's like so much history in there that's hard to
so much, yeah.
But
And
that's the
you guys
gist of how
came
it
from
starts.
Different backgrounds at first as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally different backgrounds. So I came more from the typology background and was just super into it. And Joel had a little bit of understanding about typology from like a long time ago, but he came into it more from like he had owned businesses. He knew what he was doing in internet marketing. And so when we married the two things, Joel is now much further ahead in his understanding and awareness about models and personality types than I am in my business and marketing awareness. So he basically it was a merging of those two worlds.
Right.
And so he, is that okay if I present it that way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
right.
that's basically
It's
what
true,
happened.
so
It's true. So what happened is when we first started working together, he he says 2014, but it was really January of 2014 when he said we have to start a podcast. And I was like, yeah, sure. Okay, whatever. That sounds fun. And we had like 300 downloads the first month. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. 300 people listen to our podcast. And I was like super excited about that. But he has introduced every smart thing we've ever done in Personality Hacker. And so that's kind of the merging of those two worlds.
Cool. Awesome. Did you guys always okay, so you were identifying as an ENFP and an ENTP, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Did you always
identify ENFP? She's ENTP. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Did you always identify as those types, or did they come out over time?
So when I first got into it when I was like 14, and I had Kiersey's Please Understand Me.
Nice.
And I originally typed out as an ENTJ. And I think the reason why is because my older brother, who was incredibly influential in my life, is an ENTJ. So I had mapped my identity so much to him that I was answering all the questions
As if you were
effectively.
him.
Yeah, or the way that he would want me to answer them, right? Because he was the voice in my head. And it took a while, probably a couple of years, for me to realize that I definitely was not an ENTJ. Because Kiersey called the ENTJ the commandant, which I thought was really funny. And but it didn't take long for me to realize that I definitely wasn't. And so, but I realized pretty young I wasn't, that my best fit type is ENTP. So that was pretty early sets.
Yeah. And then for me in my early 20s, I'd taken tests and I came out as ENTP.
Wow.
And I think it was that tertiary 10-year-old extroverted thinking that was really coming up for me a lot, because I'd like trained myself in my background to lean on that heavily. So I'd often type out as an ENTP or a thinker. And only later, and I'm also in an Enneagram system, which is another system of Myers-Briggs. I also am in the head triad. So a lot of my understandings are cerebral. Even though I'm a feeler, I show up on testing much like a thinker would, even though I'm not a thinker at all.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah.
Nice. So you were originally tested with Myers-Briggs. Like I guess you guys saw Myers-Briggs wasn't a full, complete package and you needed to contribute more? You needed to change something, add something? Is this right?
Well, I think actually there might be a misunderstanding that personality hacker has sort of co-opted the base of the system and turned it into something else, when really it's actually almost the opposite is our desire. Our desire is to stick pretty closely with Jungian cognitive functions, and in the book Gifts Differing, I think it's Isabel's book, right? She goes way into cognitive. Oh, she doesn't go way into it. She mentions cognitive functions fairly frequently throughout that book, and I know people have read that book and don't even know that that's what she's talking about at times. And so, what we decided to do was to take the foundation and try to massively simplify it so that people who were getting lost in all this terminology and all this language, and especially things that are barriers of entry for understanding the system, like what's the difference between a judger who's a person, a dichotomy, right? The judger dichotomy versus a judging function. The same term is being used, but two different applications, but applications that are similar enough to become confusing. And so, so what we wanted to do was take that and turn it into something that was very accessible. So all those people who had read Gifts Differing and didn't realize that cognitive functions had been mentioned in it, people who were kind of getting frustrated with cognitive function content online and felt like there was almost a hazing process, like there's this barrier of entry. We wanted to make it as simple as possible so people can break through that barrier of entry, and then once they have a foundational understanding of functions, then they can get into the more nuance. So our system isn't really, it's not really a system as it is a methodology for explaining the system that's already there. We haven't really added much to it. And there are a lot of different avenues a person can go down if they want to get more nuanced. They can go down Beebe's model, like the 8-function model. And there's a lot of other upcoming models that people are introducing with lots more nuance and things that are very, go way down certain rabbit holes. But we kind of feel like our job is to be an entry point into understanding functions in and of themselves, which is why we use nicknames for the functions and why we use what we call the CAR model to understand them. And then if people want to go further down that rabbit hole, we offer, I almost kind of see it as like, there's all these different roads a person can go down once they get past that barrier of entry. Once they understand that functions are a thing, there's like all these different roads they can go down. They can go down a road of, I'm noticing lots of people talking about social engineering, so they can use it for that capacity. I'm noticing people talking about it for understanding like all this depth of nuance of individual type. And our decision was to go down the road of personal growth and development. So how do you use what you understand as the base of the system to apply these principles in your life to become the best version of yourself, to manifest the best version of yourself? So all of our stuff is more application based, and it's more about reflecting back. Like I mean, quite frankly, if you go down the road that we recommend people go down, you get to a point where you realize that type is just a manifestation of ego. And at a certain point, you can just completely let it go, and it doesn't have to mean anything to you. But in order to get there, you have to have been reflective enough to sort of understand how your ego works. So this is just one node in understanding the ego, right? Like what is Antonia? Well, Antonia identifies as an ENTP. That's a part of how Antonia is. And eventually you get to a point where you're like, oh, that's just all that dance that Antonia does, being an ENTP and all that stuff. And eventually at the end of that road is an ability to let it go. And get to a space where you're like, well, if it's helpful, I'll use it. And if it's not, then it's an option sitting on the shelf for me. And so if you go down the road that we recommend, you eventually get to a point where you almost like let go of type and let go of models and systems. But the models and systems are helpful to get to that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. I'm definitely seeing your NE here because you're branching in all these different directions. There's a lot to unpack here. Yeah.
My apologies.
No, it's okay. Yeah. It's just an I user here. It's a little hard, but I got it.
All right. I'll try to be more streamlined.
Yeah, no, we're good.
I think what she's saying is we're looking for places where people are already trying to access who they are, like access points.
Right.
And we'll meet people where they're at those access points. And we found a really great access point for our passion, which is to help people grow themselves personally, become better versions of themselves. We found a lot of people that are into Myers-Briggs they almost are pre-primed for that. They're almost ready to find ways to make changes in their lives that'll better them. And so we're like, that's an access point. We can talk to people there at a system that, I mean, it's not like it's empirically true. It's just it's a framework to understand like ourselves a little bit, but it's an access point for us to become better. And I think that's really the key of what we see this as.
Right. Yeah. So let's unpack that a little bit because there's a lot
Sure.
in there. Yeah. So you guys are saying that Myers-Briggs is just a starting point. It's just something to type yourself, and you need to understand what it means. And so you guys are really there to help people understand what their Myers-Briggs type means and type them correctly if they've been mistyped. And then also go on a road of personal growth and let go of their ego and their type in the end.
Correct.
Is that a good summary?
Right. Yeah, well, I guess yes, and I would say just a little bit of nuance in there is create an interdependent relationship with their type, meaning that we're not fully dependent on the type. Like I don't need you to know that I'm an ENTP or I identify as an ENTP in order for you to understand who I am as a person, right? Like I don't need that, and I don't need that for me to understand who I am as a person. And when I think about being an ENTP, it does explain an awful lot at the same time. So it's building a relationship with type that isn't too dependent on it. It's not like the sum total of your identity. And at the same time, having that piece of information it's almost like shorthand for a lot of things that do explain things about me. So if I tell you I identify as an ENTP, then all of a sudden there's a bunch of information I just communicated to you about like how I operate and, that I'm leading with extroverted intuition. You're like, oh, that makes sense because you're opening up all these loops, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, that makes sense, right? But at the same time, if you and I were having a conversation and it never came up, it would be fine. You would just be like, oh, you're talking about a lot of different subjects at the same time. Let's talk about one thing at a time.
Right.
So it's creating a relationship with it so that's helpful. It explains a lot, but we don't become too dependent on it as a way of understanding who we are.
Yeah, no, I get that. Cause like a lot of people that get typed, they let that box them in and they say, no, this is me. And they don't feel comfortable to go outside of their type. And really personal growth is the journey outside of your type and not staying in it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's a really important nuance that you added. I'm wondering how, like you guys see the functions a bit different. You see them in terms of age and you see your personal growth in terms of functions as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the age component that we have in the CAR model isn't set in stone. It's a metaphor.
Yeah.
It's a metaphor for
maturity.
Yeah, for maturity and accessibility.
Just to be clear for somebody that may be watching or listening, we're not talking about the age of the person. When you said age, you're talking about applying ages to cognitive functions in what we call the CAR model. Just to give somebody, in case they're a new watcher, like a frame of reference for what you meant by that.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, so we keep talking about CAR models if people know what that means. And in the model that we use, we talk about the 4 cognitive functions that are the primary influences in each person's type as a driver, a co-pilot, a 10-year-old, and a 3-year-old. Mm-hmm. And so one of the reasons why we call it a 10-year-old is not that everybody's, in technical terms, it would be your tertiary function. Not that everybody's tertiary function has capped out at 10, and then that's just the age all tertiary functions are. It's more that we give more credence to a 10-year-old than we do to a 3-year-old. So in our function stack, we have a tendency to listen to our tertiary more than we listen to our inferior, or at least consciously we do. So we've got like those were like good metaphorical ages for our relationship to them. But I would say that the one thing that we hammer home, to answer your question, the one thing we hammer home the most is the necessity to develop the auxiliary or the co-pilot function. Okay. And one of the reasons why we do that is because it gives us access to both attitudinal worlds, like both the introverted and the extroverted world. And that keeps introverts from being too lost in their own inner domain and unable to interface with the outside world, which has a tendency to happen if an introverted type doesn't do a lot of work on their auxiliary function, which is extroverted, and vice versa. If an extrovert doesn't do work on their introverted auxiliary function, then they have a tendency to live out here, but then lose connection with who they are internally. So that's really kind of the primary thing we hammer home. And we feel like in personal development, it's a leverage point. It's not the complete story, and there's a lot more nuance to it, but because we live in a
first step.
it's a first step. And since we live in a soundbite world, if we can get one soundbite out there, that's the soundbite. The soundbite is work on your auxiliary function. And we do believe it's a first step towards growth for sure.
So both of you guys obviously have already worked on this yourselves. So you've worked on your FI and your TI. So then after you've done this, did you feel like you needed to keep working for personal growth?
Oh
yeah, definitely. Right.
Well, it was a journey of suffering for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was horrible. It's horrible to do this, man. It's just like something you're trying to grow, right? And focus on. And it's like, it's destabilizing and you want to fall back on old things that have worked before. And it's like learning any new skill or trying to grow in any way.
Right.
For me, it was very destabilizing. Lots of tears and sadness and frustration and like false starts.
Yeah.
It's totally.
Lots of contending with one's ego too.
Yeah, for me.
So for Joel working on his FI, and we're always trying to master it. If the question is like, have we mastered that and moved on? The answer is no and yes, in the sense that both of us no longer primarily focus on that function because we've done so much work around it. And also it's a lifetime of mastery, right?
It's like a martial art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just keep going, right? You never stop.
Yeah. And the next piece we feel was not just developing the tertiary or the 10-year-old function, but actually the balance between the auxiliary and the tertiary, because they're on a polarity. Yeah. Right? Like introverted thinking and extroverted feeling would be mine. And that's a polarity. And it's getting the balance right of those two functions. And so that's oftentimes what the next step after developing your auxiliary is trying to like balance that out. And then of course, we also do work on our inferior or 3-year-old function by recognizing it's an aspiration and honoring that and allowing it to be like a ballast for us. Since both of us are ENPs, our inferior or 3-year-old function is introverted sensing. And there's like we can feel when we don't feel rooted enough. We can feel when we are a little bit too any all over the place. Like we need a balance for all of it to sort of not deal with blank page syndrome all the time. It's like, if everything's possible, then nothing's possible. You know, like it's almost like you don't do anything. So you've got to find through lines. You've got to find something that roots you and commits you. Right. And now, so we do that too. Yeah.
So is there a difference between EPs and IJs balancing their functions with IPs and EJs? Like balancing the judging functions is what you guys were focusing on first versus balancing the observation, the perceiving functions?
You mean, does it look really different?
Does it look different? Is the process different?
Yeah, it's gonna be different for each person. And there's patterns that you can probably see. So I think what your question is when you're focused on a perceiving cognitive function that's your co-pilot or auxiliary, does that look different than a judging function that's your co-pilot auxiliary? Is that going to look different for those types of people? And definitely, because it's going to be more about, when you're focused on something that's perceiving, it's going to be about what you're seeing, the reality you're taking in, the territory you're expanding. And when you're working on your judging, it's about the should statements, what you are deciding about, the evaluative criteria of making a decision to move forward. So it's going to be a little bit different work, I think, in like somebody like yourself as an ISTP, right? You're looking to grow your co-pilot auxiliary function, extroverted sensing, of taking in more territory to feed your primary, which is your introverted thinking, the data that you're pulling in. You're wanting to expand that. And what's really interesting is you're actually going to your inferior of extroverted feeling. You're creating social connections in media. Right? You're doing it in a very aspirational way. You're connecting with us, people that are in this, to feed the introverted thinking part of you, to expand your territory of what you're seeing. So it's interesting how you're doing it as an ISTP to watch the strategy you've deploy, basically. Right. And that's a little different than maybe I would go about growing my judging function, right? It was introverted, so I had to get more in touch with who I was. It was a little quieter. It wasn't about expanding territory. It was about finding what resonated in the core of my being about the things I was making decisions about. Does this make sense?
Yeah. For sure. So, yeah, I'm wondering how you would have grown your 3-year-old functions as well. I'm going to use your terminology here. So, sure. Do you grow them or just focus on them as an ideal?
So I think it depends on where the person is at in their development. I think the action changes depending upon the timeline. Right. So if a person is earlier on in their personal development process, if they're using this model, right, to inform how they're going to grow, I think that if it's early on, a person going to that inferior or 3-year-old function to grow it, I think is a mistake. I think that's too early in the process. And our sort of theory or metric that we mention is that anytime you're talking about functions that are not your natural talents or strengths, is 3 times the effort for half the return. Whereas when you're developing your dominant or auxiliary or driver co-pilot, you're going to put half the amount of effort in for 3 times the return. So the leverage point is really sticking with those natural talents, right? Anytime you're naturally talented at something, you enjoy it, you're going to get better at it faster than things you're not talented at. And so that's a leverage point there.
Mm-hmm.
But as a person goes on in their growth process and further down in the timeline, if they put a lot of legwork into developing those strengths and they feel good about that, and now it's kind of like when you lose a whole bunch of weight, and at the end, it's like that last 5 or 10 pounds almost takes as much effort as the first 40 did, right?
Yeah.
You kind of get to that place where with your driver and co-pilot or dominant auxiliary, you put all the time and effort into it. And now it's just a matter of like refining it and getting better at it over time. And at that point, if you're not pouring so much of your resource into developing those aspects, then when you start to get to the backseat passengers or that tertiary inferior, now you can put more time into it. And I feel like the leverage point there isn't just growing those functions. It's actually learning how to balance them with the talents. Because when you have a hammer, all the world's a nail. And for each of us as types, whenever we look at a problem, we're taking our hammers to them, right? We're taking our dominant auxiliary functions and we're just trying to beat the hell out of the nails, because we have these hammers. But I think what happens when we acknowledge the sort of the wisdom and the elements that the tertiary and inferior or 10-year-old, 3-year-old bring in, and we can balance them out. Now we're not one-trick ponies. Now it's not just like beat all the nails with a hammer. I think we have a little bit more nuance. So I see this as an ENTP. And by the way, when we talk about developing auxiliary or co-pilot, we're not just like, as an ENTP, you should sit down and do lots of thinking because it's introverted thinking. So think a lot, right? Like that's not what we're really talking about. When I started truly developing my auxiliary function of introverted thinking, the thing that I had to do is I had to figure out how I was lying to myself about my entire life. Like I had to figure out what truths was I sacrificing in behalf of maintaining relationships that required me to deny my personal realities in order to maintain them. And I had to choose my personal truths over those relationships. And I ended up losing all those relationships. This was the time period where I left the religion of my youth. And I ended up getting shunned by my entire religion, which means I wasn't able to talk to my family or any of my friends anymore. And this happened in my late 20s. And so developing my introverted thinking wasn't simply a matter of like sitting down and like analyzing things. It was figuring out what I was lying to myself about and bringing my life into alignment with what made analytical sense to me, which was an enormous project that took a decade, right? Like it was painful and awful, and I had to make a million different terrible decisions and basically set fire to my life, right? So when we say, it wasn't a fun thing. It was like, it required me to make changes that were literally devastating. But I ended up truly developing that auxiliary because I was like, I'll never put my brain in a vice again. I will never make choices based on my relationships if it goes against what makes logical sense to me. Like I'm going to think the thoughts that my brain believes are the thoughts I should be following. And then once I got to a place where the ecosystem of my life was a lot more in alignment with like what makes sense to me, right? What is in alignment with my introverted thinking. And then all of a sudden, I realized that I was lacking some compassion. I was doing these radically honest truths, and I was, because I had been hurt by relationships, I was now willing to hurt relationships. And that wasn't honoring my extroverted feeling. So then it was a matter of like incorporating compassion and sympathy into my introverted thinking. So then it was like, now I'm working on my extroverted feeling, right?
You guys call it harmony, correct?
Harmony, right? That's our nickname. Right. And so it was a matter of like bringing more love and compassion and, into my life. And so that was my 10-year-old or tertiary work. And then when I got to my inferior, which I'm kind of working on now, it's a matter of figuring out like how am I just basically the human version of a forest fire? Like, how am I just jumping around all the time and not actually like creating a structure? how am I just way too all over the place? And one of the things I'm realizing, which is kind of interesting, is that my ballast has now suddenly become my health. For introverted sensing, I'm like creating a much more regimented nutrition structure and diet structure. I'm going to yoga 3 times a week. I'm like working out all the time. And it's because I realized my ballast has to be about honoring my body, which is just a very interesting emergent, considering that introverted sensing is my 3-year-old or inferior. So it's like, it's one of those things where we don't believe that you just stay in those top 2 functions. You eventually get to all of them, but it's not just a matter of creating silos and working on them independently. It's actually a matter of putting them all in sort of this ecosystem, this orchestrated ecosystem of honoring all these parts of you, but not giving the backseat passengers too much power, and at the same time not neglecting or marginalizing them. It's almost like a family unit. It's like a family dynamic. You get through this thing where you're honoring everybody, but you're not giving too much power to the kids, and at the same time you're not neglecting the kids. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Do you have to implode your life in order to grow, like go through personal growth, or can you like tone down that TI and just spend a little time on FE at the same time so that you don't do that? Yeah.
I had to implode my life because I was living a lie, right? And so if you're living a lie, you might have to implode the life, right? It's like it's where you're at.
Well, for you, it was controlled demolition, because it probably would have happened. So when you say you have to blow up your life or demolish your life, often when you change, big things change in your life, from my experience. Mm-hmm. So it probably, depending on how fast you're going, things are going to implode or explode around you. And if you have a controlled demolition, if you're doing that with a controlled sense and any speed you want to, I guess that's a choice somebody can make. Or just make changes and then things around you will kind of either blow up or atrophy or change just because of those things. So I don't think you have to blow stuff up. You chose that path. Well, I didn't choose that path. I didn't blow things up as much.
Right. No. Well, you kind of, your life was already falling apart.
But I made changes that just, just made things kind of explode around me. It wasn't like I was controlling demolition as much as she was.
Well, and it depends on how controlling your ecosystem is too. Like, I happen to be in a religion that said you're not allowed to think anything outside this religion, otherwise we're going to hemorrhage you out of it. And so because of the context that I was in, I had to do that in order to...
Stakes were higher.
The stakes were higher. Yeah. And it was just the circumstance I found myself in. If you have a context or circumstance where the people around you are supportive and loving, and when you make changes, they cheer you on and salute you, then you're in an enviable situation and you probably won't have to put a mushroom cloud to your life. So it probably depends on how far along you are in the process and how forgiving your ecosystem is.
But you've probably heard this quote where, what is it? Like, people don't want you to change because they just figured out how to control you as you are. So as you change, people's responses and dynamics with you alter, and then they're like, oh, and they try to like jump into control, or they cut things off, or they act weird.
Yeah.
So I think anybody that's making changes in their life or growing is going to have that experience at some level as they're doing that.
Because people don't want you to change, sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, they know how to interface with how you are right now. And it's very destabilizing to them. Like, oh, what does this mean about me if this person's changing in this way?
Yeah.
So another thing, like you were talking about, Antonia, I'm going to pick on you because you were talking.
I do all the talking.
Yeah, no, but you were talking about being in a place of a lot of control on you. Couldn't your NE have also broken out of that with its need for freedom? Couldn't that have been a way to get out as well?
Yeah, actually, I believe that the reason why I eventually left was because neither of my two my dominant auxiliary function, neither was being particularly honored. The thing is that I was given just enough freedom, or just enough optimism, I guess, to be able to believe that it was okay as long as I got to maintain those relationships. And so there was sort of this unspoken rule that you could ask any question as long as you came to the right answer. And the perceived freedom in my young, immature NE was, but they're giving me the freedom to ask any question, right?
Right.
And it was when my TI eventually got offended that I had to come to their conclusion that the two of them together were like, I don't think this is working for me anymore.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So let's turn the tables. Did you also implode your life
Joel?
Joel, yeah, sorry.
It's all good, man. It's all cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, that basically ended up that way. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't implode it as much control as she did because I wasn't under such a rigid control system, or I wasn't inside of like a quote unquote cult, if you will. But I basically
You can take the quotes down. It's a cult. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
the quotes down, the quotes down, the quotes.
The quotes. You can just
basically, I
remove
mean,
the quotes.
basically, what I'm
Sensitive.
yeah,
Because maybe there's people that are part of the cult watching, and
yeah, I don't want to be offensive to people because I don't.
that's good FE there.
Not the point. But yeah, so I did what happened. I just made changes, and then people responded to those changes, and often they got hostile or cut me out because of those. That was a little bit more. You knew, like, structurally when you crossed a boundary, like she kind of knew that when she started to grow and she made changes, there was going to be a formal like decision from like the organization that she was a part of and her family that you're now across a line that's no longer acceptable. There was no line that I crossed as far as like official. And so every individual person in my life responded in their own unique way.
Right.
And so that was, in some ways, it was more complex for me to move through that because people weren't just going wholesale, like, well, you're out now. It was kind of like, well, you're not out, but we don't approve. And so it was actually a lot messier for me. It was less of a straight line of differential in my life. So it's been a long journey of kind of reconciling these messy relationships that ended up they were atrophying, like with my family and other people that knew me. And it's like been a very difficult journey through that. So that's more of my life. It was less imploding and more strained. It was almost like strained muscles of relationship, if that would make a metaphor. Right. That's how I experienced it.
Yeah, I'm seeing it a lot like the hero's journey, like that Samwise who says, "This is the furthest I've ever been. I don't know if I can go one step further." Yeah. So like, do you recommend still, after having gone through all that people should go through personal growth and risk all of that hardship?
Yeah.
Unquestionably.
Yeah.
There is the previous world or the previous life I was living is a death by 1,000 cuts. It's like, do I want to keep status quo or simpatico or equilibrium, but then die never having known who I am? Like not truly known myself. Or would I be willing to go through all of that shit, all of that muck and mess? But at the end of it, I get to have me. And Joel and I were talking about it like a week or so ago, where I was like, ultimately you die alone. Everybody dies alone, right? Like you got people like there touching you and holding you, that your final exit is you and you alone.
Death's door is solo.
Yeah. You go through yourself. And at the end of my days, I want to be able to tell that person that I did everything I could to honor them. Like at the end of my days, I want to be able to tell myself that I did what I could to honor this journey. And in the previous incarnation, before we did all this work and before I did the work of, graduating past my earlier life, it doesn't even have to be religion for a person. It could be literally anything. But when I went through all of that, at the end of it, with all the battle wounds and scars and all that stuff, I came out with me, right? Like I got to have me, which is really the only thing I have anyway. Right. So yeah, I cannot articulate how much more fulfilled and rested I am into myself. I used to be really anxious and insecure and nervous all the time about what people thought of me and their opinion of me and whether or not I was, I was acceptable to them. And now I don't really have to worry about that anymore. It's like you go through a baptism by fire and it's just like, well, you just show up as who you are and the world can respond as it chooses to. And so that's a feeling that I don't think people recognize how beautiful that feeling is until they get it. And then once you're there, you wouldn't change anything for it. Or at least in my opinion, I feel that way.
Yeah. So it sounds like you got through that point where you found yourself. And then you were talking about earlier about you need to get a point after that where you let go of yourself. So how did that happen? Or are you still sort of working through that?
Always, right? Yeah, always. Yeah, because the ego is so, I mean, it's so sneaky. The ego is so sneaky. It just always finds a way to reinsert itself. I think what ends up happening is if you haven't found yourself, what ends up happening, I think, is that we get caught in this trauma. We get caught in this perpetual healing work. And that whole phrase of like, get over yourself, it's really hard to get over yourself when yourself is just a puddle of pain all the time. And so going through personal growth and development and getting to a place where you can heal your own traumas or get to a place of healing, then now you can just sort of like relax for a second. You don't always have to do pain management or trying to pretend your life is okay when it's not, or whatever it is. You don't have to like play all these tricks on yourself. And then when you get to that place where you're like, you've maybe gone through a baptism by fire, like I'm talking about, or maybe just did some basic growth and development and discovered who you are and feel rested and feel like you've healed from whatever traumas you have in the past. Now you can ask what else is available. And for me, when I got to that place of healing my traumas, what became extremely obvious to me is all of my stories and narratives that are in the sort of the software of my brain. All these things that make me unhappy, all these things that are like just these scripts that run all the time that encourage me to think ill of myself, encourage me to think ill of the world, things that just aren't serving me anymore. And so, to me, getting past your ego or doing ego work is really a matter of like recognizing that it's the ego's job to try to save itself. It's the ego's job to try to like keep itself going. And these scripts are what it believes are a way for its own survival. Like feeling ill about myself or feeling ill about others. Somehow my ego thinks I have to have those stories in order to survive. And it's a matter of just sort of letting them go. Just sort of one at a time, letting some of the stories go, or watching the story and go, I can't get rid of that one right now. That one's just too deeply embedded, but I'm not going to attach to it and call it reality. I'm just going to give some distance and go, okay, that's just Antonia running one of her scripts again. That's just her thinking she's whatever, she's ugly, or thinking nobody likes her, or whatever it is, right? And then just sort of watching it happen, and then just sort of watching it slow down and stop spinning, and then it's okay again. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you have something to chime in on that, Joel? On the process of letting go of yourself?
Well, it's tough to do. I would say that hard. She makes it sound like, oh, this is an easy process. Like, love yourself.
Right.
But it's like, I mean, it's constant struggle. Like I want control. I want safety. I want approval, right? To let those things go is like, why would you, like, it's unnatural for us to do this as humans. So it's like, really, it's a constant like battle of like trying to go, okay, I don't have to control the situation. I don't need approval from this. I'm not unsafe here. I can just be in this space. And I think that's just, I think I want to speak to how difficult it is. It's not an easy thing to do. And it's challenging. It always feels like you're struggling against yourself. And I think that's something that sometimes we don't talk enough about, of giving people grace. It's like we expect perfection from people and like always hustle. But man, it's a lot of like one step forward, two steps back feeling sometimes. Like this, sometimes I feel really demoralized even now after working on myself so much. I'm like, man, why did I react to that person? Why did I just yell at Antonia about this thing that I thought I got past that like 5 years ago? Like, why did they even trigger me? Why am I so stupid? And then I get in like this self-defeating loop, self-attack. And it's like, I think we need to understand, to give grace to ourselves when that happens. Like, that's the message that I keep trying to remember to help myself and other people understand. It's like, this is a process. And it's going to feel like it's a discipline and a lifestyle choice over time. It's not like something you do and it's like, okay, well, I did that. I'm done with that. It's like, it's more like anything that we change in our lives, it's beneficial. It's like an entire shifting of how you go about life.
And to loop, is it okay if I loop type back into it? Okay. So to loop type back into it, what we've noticed is that knowing our best fit types has helped us find the right tools to do that. Yes. So one of the things I do is I use my introverted thinking to identify the programming in my mind, identify all the scripts, and to see if I can do anything to reprogram myself. Like, does it make sense? Does it make analytical sense? And so I do a lot of like, I just call it sort of script running. Go through, look at the lines of code in my mind.
Try to find where you're lying to yourself.
Where am I lying to myself, right? Like, what is a line of code that somebody else gave to me that I've adopted, but actually isn't mine? It was an outsourced line of code. And if I erase it, what other ideas or beliefs is it attached to, and how will I impact those? So that's sort of my work.
And then for me, for introverted feeling, it's more about tracking all my motivations, plural motivations that are driving me. Why did I just yell at her? What was my motivation? That, oh, I've got pride or this, or, oh, I was fearful that this was going to happen. Oh, I see that coming up for me. tracking those, getting the root of them, and addressing the core motivations rather than the behavior, because the behavior is coming from those motivations. So my introverted feelings, tracking those. Like, why am I doing this? Come much like an actor. Like, what's my motivation here, right? Like, that's what I'm always looking for in this from a type standpoint.
So for me, systems thinking was a game changer. Understanding and learning systems thinking was super important for me. Learning formal logic was super important for me. And I still do a lot of reading around those kinds of things. Whereas with Joel, he's been doing energy work. And the energy work has been a game changer. So understanding our types has helped us become attracted to tools that are more sort of in our wheelhouse. And we're doing the same work, right? We're both doing ego work, or at least attempting to, but he's doing it through an energetic, sort of more introverted feeling stance. And I'm doing it through more of a technician, mental process, digital information, introvert thinking. And that's actually worked beautifully for us. And sometimes he gets the benefit of one of my tools and I'll get the benefit of his tools. But if I was working with a coach who's maybe, say, an NFP, and they're like, oh, energy work is the way you have to do it, and that was my first starting point, I don't think it would have been as powerful for me. I would have been like, yeah, this is kind of cool, I guess. Whereas for him, like, Joel has taken it to like a duck to water, and his energy work has been a game changer for him. Whereas the opposite is probably true. If somebody came along and was like, well, you have to understand how the mind is like, is a hardware, and you have to go and look at it through software. He'd be like, okay, this is kind of cool, but I don't think it would have impacted him like it did us. So understanding our types has helped us find the right tools to do the same work, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So does personality hacker help coach people through this process? Like figure out where they are at, what their next steps should be, that sort of thing? How do you guys help people in this way? Yeah.
Well, that's fundamentally what we, transformation is the thing that we try to smuggle into everything we do, right? Because as Joel mentioned, type is one of the reasons why we've chosen this, basically like sort of this field. This field, this model, is people already are interested in who they are. Otherwise they wouldn't be attracted to this. And most people want to know how to implement what they're learning. That's almost always the next question is, okay, well, now that I know this, what do I do about it? And so it's a perfect on-ramp. And one of the things that we try to do, which is why we don't go super nuanced technician, like go deep into all these different elements, is because, and we try to just master the basics, is because ultimately you're trying to leave cookie-crumb trails to transformation. And so it's something that we try to weave into everything. So like in the book that we wrote, we highlight a lot of things called like loops and grips. So a loop is when, all of this is when your cognitive functions aren't working exactly the way that you want it to work, want them to work. And so we provide recommendations for getting into exercises to balance some of these functions out so that it's working more like that family dynamic. It's working the way it should be. And we feel like if people take that advice, they'll start to see transformation happen in their life. We have a program called Profiler Training. And it's a intensive course, online course that culminates in a 5-day live event. And sometimes it's in LA and sometimes it's on the East Coast. But the thing that we love the most is when people at the end of the 5 days are like, that was really good content.
They're there to learn a skill.
They're there to learn a skill, right? They're there to learn to definitely a skill. But when at the end of 5 days, they feel like their life was changed. And, we've had people spend like 3 days straight crying at Profiler Training. It's like, well, you're just learning a skill, so why would you be crying? And the answer is because they feel like they're really changing as people. So it's our smuggle. It's like our mischievous mustache.
Don't tell anybody.
Don't tell anybody. But ultimately, everything we do, all roads lead to ego transformation work, and that's that's ultimately the name of the game.
And there's like kind of 3 parts to this. It's the awareness, like, oh, I'm this type. That's interesting. What about that? And then you explore that, and then you have that transformation or growth. And I think the next step that is for us, as far as the business and where we're headed, is we want to start building a contributive frame. So a contributive frame, contributive. I don't know why I said it that way. It's a weird pronunciation. Now I sound Canadian, like you. I don't know. But contributive, like basically take what you know now and contribute. So there's a lot of kids that are coming up on YouTube, a lot of other people that are coming up, like they're talking about type. People doing shows like yours that we're like, how do we help add more fuel to those fires? People talking about this and then help shape the conversation that's like growth focused.
Right.
Leading the conversation, not just for its own sake, but what are we going to do about this as humans? Why is this important? Like, why are we talking about this? It's just another exercise in a hobby, or is there usefulness here for something? So that contributor frame is really where our attention is focused, and how can we help people contribute back after they learn, become aware, and then grow and transform. Now they're going to give back to help other people do the same pathway that they just came through.
Yeah.
Right. So do you guys recommend, if you've already been typed by MBTI, could they have been mistyped? Do you recommend going to your website first and doing a test or something first? Like, how do you recommend?
People have different starting points.
Yeah.
People have different starting points depending on where they're at. Sometimes
so if you're at the very beginning, where do you go?
So I mean, we do have an online test. I wouldn't say that if a person has taken a different test, then come to ours, because ours is the definitive one that will tell you what your type is. I mean, ours is an online test like everybody's, and maybe I shouldn't reveal that piece of information, but all online tests have an error rate. So,
including MBTI itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially,
So there's the starting point is taking tests and collecting as much information as you can about the types that you feel most attracted towards, or like you feel like most resonate with you. And then at that point, I think that trying to master cognitive functions and trying to really understand what these functions mean and whether or not you're using them is definitely a next step. So familiarizing yourself, it's like the tests are like it is definitely a starting point, and then being radically honest with yourself and trying to figure out what the intent of each of these types is, and then matching yourself to a type, I think is,
right.
I mean, and everybody's journey is different.
So then you recommend them to read your book as a next point, or?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Everybody should read it. Everybody should read our book. We say this on our podcast,
right?
But everybody should have 11 copies of our book.
11,
Yeah, 11 copies.
Not 12, not 10, 11.
No, 11. Because we're pretty sure that the zombie apocalypse is coming. And so you're going to need 10 copies of the book for, hiding things in, and for feeding fires, and then one book to rebuild civilization. We definitely hawk our book as much as humanly possible. So yes, please buy our book. And we do think it's a good one. We think it's a great book to start out with.
And then is there a course that people can take? Like, they go to your website, they find all the information there. I'll put everything in the description at the bottom.
Okay, thank you.
The website, the YouTube channel, and a link to buy your book as well.
Cool.
Is there something else?
Yeah, well, we have a series of courses. So we have courses that talk about different subjects. The entry course is called a starter kit, a personality development starter kit. And so if you know your type and then you buy the starter kit, then you end up getting like a lot of advice about your type, and how your cognitive functions work, and how to develop them, right? That's kind of the point of that. But then we also have products around relationships and wealth generation, depending upon your personality type. And then it all culminates into the Profiler training course that we mentioned. That's our sort of flagship program that we launch every 6 months. So we just launched one, and we have a full class, which is cool. And then we'll do another one in December, and that's our live events. So,
right.
Yeah.
And you also give out certification, a type of certification in your class?
Yeah. So if you take Profiler training and then you choose to, the next piece after that is to get certified. And then it's a bit of an intense, we like to certify people that we believe are good at what they do. And so it takes 4 to 6 months to go through the original content. And then it takes about 6 months to get certified. So it's like a whole year process. But then at the end of that, people can have conversations. And at the end of the conversation, it takes it away from a test. Like the point of Profiler training is to take typing away from a test where a person self-assesses, depending upon, because those things can change depending upon your mood or what you ate that day or whatever. And it turns the person asking questions into the instrument. And so through the course of asking questions and having a conversation with the individual, then the profiler becomes the person who helps the other person find their best fit type. And so it's building that skill of helping other people identify what their best fit type is, kind of like a Sherpa going up a mountain. So
awesome. Great. Is there any final thoughts or anything that you might want to say just to sum up what we've been talking about?
I just want to thank you, Benjamin, for what you're doing. I think this is really cool. You're highlighting people in the type community and spreading the word. And I want to encourage you to keep doing this, because I think this is a really great, it's probably helping you learn, but you're helping bring people that are probably new to this. You're giving it exposure, you're giving it a platform for people to access it. So I just really want to express gratitude for you, and keep going on this. This is awesome what you're doing, man. I want to just encourage you for it. So thank you.
Thanks, man. So yeah, check out Personality Hacker and have a good one. Bye.